Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, chapter 3, Halacha 2, and I really found this one to be a diamond and delightful while I was preparing for this. So the Mishnah starts off and it says that one who wishes to trim the leaves of the vegetables that he is carrying to lighten the burden may not discard the trimmed leaves by the roadside until he tithes them. Now, there's a lot that's going on here, and I want to cover some of this. So, the Chazan Ish, in his commentary in Demai 7.5, in his book Demai 7.5, is saying that the owner cannot just leave the leaves by the roadside. By the way, we're talking about leaves that are edible. We're talking about something maybe like trimmings from Swiss chard or something like that, maybe from spinach, but we are looking at something that is edible and subject to tithes. And we're looking at, by the way, the Rambam is pointing out that the word that the Mishnah uses really has no parallel in either Hebrew or Aramaic, and that is la hazom. And he is saying about this that this is a term trying to signify untithed vegetables whose leaves are edible and subject to the miser obligation. There's a lot to unpack here. So one of the ideas here by the Chazan Ish is he has to tithe them first. And one of the ideas for why would be that he may not discard the leaves without tithing them, so that if an Amma Aretz finds him, the Amma Aretz is going to just, he's just going to eat it without taking off the tithes. Now, that seems very surprising because Hefker is going to be, there's no tithing from Hefker. So what on earth are we talking about? So we know in Mishnah Peah 1/6 that if somebody goes and finds hefker on the ground, like from vegetables, or in the case of wheat that was dropped or something like that, over there in Masechet Peah, it's talking about somebody was transporting wheat and some of the sheaves fell. Are you going to be allowed to take it or not? Do you have to do shulchas aveda? Is that going to be considered to be hefker? And over there, it's going to be considered to be hefker because the person basically has yush and it's been left. But over there, it's saying that the hefker doesn't need to be tithed. And that's the theme that we're seeing over here. So why over here, if you're trimming the leaves, would you have to worry about tithing it? Wouldn't you just say that this is all just going to be hefker and don't worry about it? So what the Mishnah is trying to do, because the Mishnah already knows that you know that, the Mishnah is trying to go back to vegetables that are already bundled up. They're already been packaged up. And we know over in the Mishnah in Maisros, in the Yerushalmi 1.5, that the tithing obligation, if somebody has already packed these up into bundles, and this is going to be a case where the tithing obligation has already been done. So if these have already been packaged over there, that the Halacha is pointing out in the Mishnah in Maisros 1.5, that the tithing obligation has been done. And so tithing them, declaring them as ownerless, does not exempt them from the miser obligation. That's what this is trying to signify. This is a few things here, right? Because one of the other subtleties here is that we're talking about these leaves. We're not talking about bundles of grain. Bundles of grain, we know that Doraita, if these have been bundled up and packaged, that these are going to have Doraita obligation for tithes. But for vegetables are going to be D'Rabbanan. And the Mishnah is very clever here. The Mishnah is talking about a case that we already know is d'Rabbanan by picking the vegetables instead of the grain, and saying even this d'Rabbanan requirement on the vegetables needs to be tithed once these have been packaged up and processed. These are not normal leaves that are left as hefker. We are talking about leaves that have already been processed. And this Mishnah's ruling is going to really apply to any produce that somebody discards, and it's referring to vegetable leaves simply to teach that the vegetable leaves, which are going to be d'Rabbanan, have to be tithed. So therefore, if you have something more serious like the grain, which is going to be d'Oraita, that for sure you have to tithe it. I think that's a good way to start looking at it. There's really a lot going on here. By the way, this is going to get back into this conversation that we had from chapter 2, halacha 4 and 5 in Demai, between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi about large quantities and small quantities. And it's going to turn out that in many ways, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi are not going to be disagreeing on this. And really, they're both going to be agreeing that when you're picking these leaves up, you're acquiring them in a small quantity. It's not going to be like acquiring a pile of grain where you see a big bundle and you've picked some up and you've acquired the bundle. This is going to be more like acquiring leket, which is going to be like acquiring the individual ears. And when you pick up leket, you're not, even if there's a pile of leket in front of you, you're picking them up individually. And that's going to be also the case here. It's more likely that you're picking up the leaves individually or small quantities of these leaves, even if there's a large pile in front of you. And it's kind of the nature of how these leaves are, is so that it's not going to be a big acquisition like what we were covering in chapter 2, halacha 4 and 5. It's going to be an acquisition by a small measure. Now, if you remember, if you are making an acquisition of a large measure, it's going to be the buyer who is subject to tithes. And over here, because this nature of acquisition of acquiring leaves is going to be a lot like acquiring individual ears of leket, it's going to be the responsibility of the seller. And in this case, it's going to be the responsibility of the fellow who has these bundled up vegetables to tithe them first. So in effect, he is effectively, in a way, disposing of them, and he has to be the one responsible of it. It's not like doing a large quantity, even though there might be a large quantity. The way it gets acquired is individual. There's a lot going on in the first part of the Mishnah, as you can see. Now, the Mishnah is going to talk about two more rulings on tithing, and that's going to be before it goes out of someone's possession. And the Mishnah reads that if someone purchases vegetables from an Amma Aretz in the marketplace, and then he decides to return them to the storekeeper, he may not return them until he tithes them. For nothing is me'usar but the count. So let's explain this. This, by the way, is going to be very similar to what we covered in Masechet Shvius. What is going to happen in the case of Shvius, where somebody is selling something that might not normally have Shvius sanctity. In the case over there, it would be hisav. Sticks of hisav can be used either as firewood or it can be used as a spice for your food, like eggs. People commonly put, it's oregano, and will commonly put that onto their eggs in the morning. Eggs and oregano go very well together. So over there in Masechet Shvius, let's say the seller has the intention that this is firewood. He's selling the hisav for firewood. The buyer comes along, he picks it up and makes an acquisition, and he declares, I'm using this for spices. Well, the seller before had a case where this had Shvius sanctity. Now, the buyer changed it so that this now has before it had no shvius sanctity, now it has shvius sanctity. And in the case over there, if he wants to return it, the seller who doesn't want it for spice, he wants to sell it for firewood, can't undo it. Since it's already been activated once as food, it now has sanctity, and we know that things can't go down in sanctity. You're not supposed to let things go down. So this will still have sanctity, and now this seller has to sell it as firewood. The intention matters, and the lifting of it matters. So when this fellow over here is looking at the vegetables and he's picking them up to acquire them, then let's say he changes his mind and he wants to return them, he's picked up Demai. Now he has to tie them. We're going to be getting into cases in the Gemara on who's going to pay for that, because now the buyer effectively is returning Demai. You can't return it untithed, and he has to compensate. And that's the idea of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He's gonna have to pay for this amount that he's taking out, and then he's going to return it. But over here, it's saying that he has to return them with tithes taken out if he should choose to return them. He had the intention, he acquired it. It's like acquiring the shvius produce and changing it with the intention. And over here, he's basically made the acquisition, and you can't do business with untithed produce. What this is trying to say is that even if it's going to be Demai, you still have to separate out the tithes. You're not supposed to be doing business with this. So if this were a haver who would be selling it, the haver, when he's selling it, would have already taken out the tithes. So presumably this haver is buying from the Amma Aretz merchant. Now we're going to get into the next case. Next case, we're going to go by the Vilna Goan to explain it. When we get to it in the Gemara, it's going to say that if he was standing and purchasing a load of vegetables, and then he saw another load of vegetables that was better than the first and decided to buy this second load instead, he is permitted to return the first load without tithing it, because he did not perform the acquisition of meshchicha. Meshchicha, by the way, is going to be the act of lifting. That is going to be when you are doing the acquisition. So the idea is that this fellow is browsing, he's picking up vegetables, but he didn't do it with the intention to acquire. He saw some other vegetables, and then he goes over to the other vegetables, and he lifts those vegetables. And what the Mishnah is teaching is that the first vegetables that he took back, because he did not acquire it, he does not need to tithe it. He does not need to tithe it when he returns it back to the merchant. In any case, when the haver is buying from the Amaretz, he will have to tithe the vegetables, whichever vegetables he purchases. So we're going to get into this sort of unusual matter of sale, and the Gemara is going to talk about Rabbi Lazar's position about this, and Rabbi Lazar is going to be getting into an explanation of what we were covering in chapter 2 between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosei. And Rabbi Meir is saying that the ruling of our Mishnah reflects the opinion of Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir says the rabbis did not permit anyone to sell Demai in a large quantity except for a wholesaler. Now, the wholesaler is going to normally deal with large quantities, and anyone who sells a large quantity of Demai first has to tithe it. So somebody who's carrying a large load of vegetables who wants to lighten the load by discarding the leaves may not do so without tithing them first. This explanation is going to be, says the Marafulda, that Rabbi Meir's opinion follows the usual manner of sale and permits only a wholesaler who generally sells in large quantities to sell Demai to a haver without first tithing it. And retailers and other individuals, however, do not generally deal in large quantities, and they may not sell or gift Demai even in large measures. And following Rabbi Meir's view, the Mishnah is ruling that an individual who discards a large quantity of these leaves must first tie them before he does it. Now, the sages are saying that they're following the actual sale, and they're allowing even the retailer to sell a large quantity of Demai without first selling it. And really, Rabbi Meir is saying you have to look at, even if it's going to be, you have to look at the transaction, says Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is saying that look at the individual transaction, and even if this retailer is normally selling small quantities, if this turns out to be a large quantity, you go by the transaction itself. So this would be a large quantity, and so he would count in the sale as a wholesaler, and he doesn't need to tithe it. The sages are saying that you go by the hazakah of who the seller is, and so if he has the hazakah of being a retailer who normally sells small quantities, then the tithing requirement is going to be on the retailer, even if he's selling a large quantity on a one-off transaction. Now, the idea here is that this Mishnah's ruling is dealing with someone who's discarding a large quantity of leaves to lighten this load. And based on this earlier Mishnah that allows someone to sell large quantities of Demai without tithing it, the question is, why does this Mishnah obligate someone who discards a large quantity of leaves to first tithe them? In other words, why doesn't it just go by the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and you move on? And it should be that it's like selling a large quantity, and you don't need to do it. Rabbi Yochanan is going to give an opinion that looks like it's in opposition, but when you look at it carefully, it actually is not contradictory, and it's actually going to be fixing the point and argument between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir on this. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to say like this. He's going to say that the Mishnah that's allowing the discarding of a large quantity of leaves only after tithing them, he says, is consistent with the opinion of everyone. In other words, the sages say it, Rabbi Meir says it, Rabbi Yossi says it, and the sages are saying, as implied by Rabbi Yochanan, that the sages would argue that the permit of selling large quantities of Demai without tithing them, it's going to apply to everyone. And here, somebody has to tithe the leaves before discarding them. Now, Rabbi Yochanan continues in this Gemara. He says, in our Mishnah, the case is different. And he's basically implying that although if you have a large quantity of leaves that were ultimately transferred from the one who is discarding them to the one who finds them, effectively what he's saying is that a transaction does not qualify this as a transfer of a large quantity of Demai. And why would that be? And this is going to get into what we talked about earlier. Rabbi Yochanan says, because the one who finds and acquires the leaves from Hefker acquires them in small measures. And furthermore, the one who discards the leaves and declares them Hefker does not declare them Hefker in a large measure. So really, this is going to be like the opinion of the sages and even Rabbi Meir. It's not a disagreement at all. In other words, the very nature of how you're trimming these leaves and the leaves that they're going to pick up is going to be where this is going to count as multiple small transactions, and the acquisitions are going to be small, and it's not going to look like you've acquired a large quantity of something like a wholesaler. And Rabbi Yochanan is effectively pointing out that everyone agrees that this is going to be disposed of and acquired in small measures. And this is not a case of a wholesaler. Now, the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that this ruling of the Mishnah, where they're treating basically the transfer of these discarded leaves as multiple transactions involving small quantities, the Gemara says, does not argue with Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir says, as soon as a person declares an object Hefker, it goes out of his possession, and his Hefker is Hefker. And basically that's going to be about the same with this Mishnah's case as well. In other words, this is not a transfer of a large measure, like if you're just getting rid of a pile of grain, you're trimming these leaves one after the other. And so these are leaving your ownership one after the other in a small quantity. And then they're also going to be acquired in a small quantity. The Gemara continues and says, for the one who is going to find these and acquire these leaves from Hefker is going to acquire them in small measures. And the one who discards the leaves and declares them Hefker does not declare them Hefker in a large measure. And effectively, what this is saying is that, in reality, the guy who's finding it is going to be picking this up, one at a time, either by a handful at a time or a leaf at a time. And the guy who's trimming them is going to be cutting these off basically one at a time. He's going to be going through, looking at the good leaves and the not good leaves. He's going to be trimming off the not as good leaves in order to lighten his load. And so there's a process where he's not really, making this whole thing Hefker like you would do for a pile of grain. So the very nature of these leaves, both in disposing of it and also in acquiring it, is going to be different than grain. That's, I think, one of the points. The Gemara continues and says, furthermore, even with Rabbi Yossi, this ruling of the Mishnah does not argue. And although Rabbi Yossi says this Gemara, that an object declared Hefker does not leave the possession of the owner until it's acquired by another party, this might contend with the one who discards the leaves and declares them Hefker, but does not render them Hefker in a large measure, and the one who goes and acquires the leaves from the Hefker does not acquire them in small measure. I want to just point out what this is saying. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi have a little bit of a disagreement here. According to Rabbi Yossi is saying that Hefker does not leave the possession of the owner until it gets acquired. Rabbi Meir's opinion says as soon as you declare it ownerless, this is going to, in fact, be ownerless. So there is a disagreement on when this actually leaves the possession. Now, in the case of this particular transaction where you're cutting off the leaves and then you're making them available, there's actually, in this case, not going to be an argument between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. They're both going to agree with the halacha. The only case would be if it comes to be where there's a disagreement on when did it actually leave the possession. So the Gemara continues and it says that in our Mishnah's case, it's different and does not constitute a transfer of Demai in a large measure. And it's saying that when he declared Hefker, it becomes Hefker only with the acquisition of the finder who's picking him up and acquiring him at that time. So whichever way you're going to look at it, whether by Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yossi, the halacha, by the way, is Rabbi Yossi, that however you want to understand this way of this Hefker mechanism of when it's acquired, the transfer of the discarded leaves is going to still have multiple transactions with small quantities. So it doesn't matter with this argument in this case between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. Both of them agree that the disposal of this and later the acquisition of these leaves is going to be multiple small transactions, and everybody is basically in agreement that really it looks like there could be a very big disagreement in this, and in fact, there really isn't. There's really not a maloket here. The maloket here between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi is not relevant to this halacha because really they're agreeing on the tithes, not on the time when. It's not relevant as to the time of the acquisition, but what they're trying to figure out is what do you do with the tithes? So, as we mentioned here, because this is going to involve multiple transactions with multiple small quantities, the seller or the guy cutting these off, he's going to be responsible for tithing it. And we covered this in chapter 2, halacha 4 and 5. Now, we're going to get into the next part, and this is going to be the next part of the Mishnah, which says if somebody purchases vegetables from the Amma Aretz in the marketplace and then he decides to return them to the storekeeper, he may not return them until he tithes them. So the Gemara is going to explain this word that the Mishnah uses, which is meusar, and the Gemara is going to say that Hizkiah says the word meusar is equivalent to the word mehasar, which means lacking. Now, in rabbinic literature, in a lot of the ways that interpretation comes in the Midrashim, a lot of times the ayin and the chet will be interchangeable, and sometimes the sin and the samech will be interchangeable. So here they are taking the word meusar and they're interchanging them, and they're changing the ayin for the het and the samech for a sin for a samech, coming up with a different word and saying lacking. And then this way of reading it, it's going to say that the Mishnah means that, says this Gemara, before returning the Demai, it has to be tithed because nothing is lacking for the owner to give the purchaser but the count. Now, generally, a kinyan does not have acquisition until a price has been agreed upon by both parties. So as long as there's no firm understanding with regards to the price, neither party commits to the sale, as they may not be able to reach an agreement on the price. But Hizkiah is explaining that with this clause in Meusar, this Mishnah is trying to clarify that we presume that the buyer really did intend to acquire the vegetables. He made a hagba, which is to lift it. And even though the total price has not been determined, this Mishnah is basically saying that the parties already agreed on a price per pack, or a price per bundle, or perhaps what this is signifying is that the seller put a sign on the vegetables saying how much this cost per bundle, and the buyer looked at that and picked it up with an acquisition. So there's effectively saying that that even though they didn't actually speak about the price, that there's still a way to determine whether a sale happened or not. Now, we also saw this in Masechet Shvius, in the same treatment about sales over there. What happens if somebody is negotiating and then they can't reach a price, and then the buyer comes and gives a new price, and then they pay the money and the seller accepts it, and then they want to return it? It still counts as a sale because one party issued a price and the other party did not protest it and actually accepted it. Now over here, in this case, even if they didn't talk about the price per bundles, if there's a sign there for price and he picks it up with the intent to make acquisition, that really he's going to have to figure out what to do with regards to tithes. How do we calculate this so that there's no theft? And in fact, the Gemara is going to be wondering that. So Hizkiah continues in the Mishnah and says, how does the purchaser carry out his obligation to tithe the produce before returning it? And Rabbi Hizkiah just says the process. It says that he takes from the leaves and the bundles, separates them as tithes, and he rectifies the produce that he's returning. So this is how it's done. In other words, he does not need to separate the tithes from the actual vegetables, but he could do it from the leaves. And then the Gemara is going to ask a question, because now, you've returned something that's different from how you took it. And the Gemara asks, it says, but is this not prohibited under the laws of theft? Now, the Gemara is going to go explore this a little bit. And the Gemara is going to say about taking an insignificant object from the owner that the owner may not care about. In this case, it would be the leaves of the product. He's selling the vegetable, and the fellow did the ties with taking off some of the leaves. And so the question is that not going to be theft? An incident comes up in this Gemara, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Kana was supporting Rabbi Lazar as he was walking. And as they passed a vineyard, Rabbi Lazar said to Rabbi Shimon Bar Kana, "Bring me one splinter from the vineyard's fence with which to pick my teeth." And Rabbi Lazar then reconsidered and said to him, "Do not bring me anything." And he explained, for if everyone is passing and would come and decide to take a splinter, then the entire fence of this person would be gone. So this, by the way, would be where this prohibition of theft might not apply if the owner does not care about the object. Now, I want to bring a midrash from Sodom, talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. This is in fact what people used to do with people who would be traveling from outside of Sodom and Gomorrah into Sodom and Gomorrah. The people in Sodom and Gomorrah would come to the new merchant, and each one would take one small thing, like a grain, a couple of grains from the person. And when the person protested, he said, "What? It's a couple of grains." But they had a way to try to drive everybody out of business there who came from outside. And it was a concerted effort. And what they would do is they would all come and all take a few of these so that there'd just be nothing left. And so Rabbi Lazar here is really, it's not just a story. He's also alluding to one of the midrashim that's a practice of what Sodom and Gomorrah would do. And, Rabbi Lazar, in this way, reconsiders it. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to say that, regarding this Mishnah, there's no need to be concerned that others would do the same, because even if the owner would not care, he can sell the produce for the same price with or without the leaves. In other words, that, if you have some carrots and they take some, trimmings off the top, you can still sell your carrots. But another way to look at this, according to, this Mishnah, would be, as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is saying, is that one who wishes to go beyond the letter of the law should in fact pay the merchant something for the leaves. And so the Yerushalmi here is dealing with an insignificant single splinter, which, by the way, it would look like nobody cares about. But regarding other items that somebody might care about, if there's a disagreement whether you can take it or not without permission, that's going to be on if you have a friend who would not object. But regarding a stranger, that's going to be another issue. So, very interesting that it goes back to a midrash that, or alludes back to a midrash that is actually concerning the behavior of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah here. And the Gemara, picks up on that and alludes to it. And the Gemara is going to give another incident. Rabbi Haggai was supporting Rabbi Zera as he was walking. And as they were walking, a certain person passed by carrying a load of wood splinters. Not even a fence, but actually splinters. And Rabbi Zera says to Rabbi Haggai, "Bring me one splinter from that load to pick my teeth." And Rabbi Zera then reconsidered and said to him, "Do not bring me anything, because if everyone will come to do the same thing, then the entire load of this person will be gone." And the Gemara is now going to explain the rationale behind Rabbi Zera's stringency. And Rabbi Zera was not so overly righteous to be concerned that perhaps the person's load of splinters will be depleted. Rather, by being stringent even regarding this splinter, he's teaching us to observe this stringency regarding other items that our inclination desires, and in which case there's a real concern that the person's load would be depleted. So the way Rabbi Zera is looking at this, according to the Rosh Cirilio, is that although the splinters, we don't need to worry that every single person is going to come and deplete all of the splinters. Rabbi Zera is being stringent so that people should not learn, so that people should learn to be stringent in similar cases with, when people are carrying something else with more value, like fruit, taking small fruit. And I've seen this in the shuk in Jerusalem before, where people will walk by and take a couple of dates from the merchant and eat them. And it is theft. And if everybody comes and does that, you've depleted their entire load. So there's another Amora who's going to explain this clause of the Mishnah. Is actually going to agree with Hiskia, and it's going to continue this explanation stream. And Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the word meusar in the Mishnah is equivalent to mehasar, which is lacking. That, by the way, is also what Hiskia says. So this is clearly part of the tradition, and basically Rabbi Abahu, who's the student of Rabbi Yochanan, says the same thing. And the Gemara continues and says, because as soon as he performs the meshchicha, in other words, he's lifting it, he's acquiring the produce, and nothing is lacking besides counting it. So, he's going to have to, he's acquired it. In this case of going back to the bundles of vegetables, he's going to have to tithe it. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is going to continue the explanation, and in this way, though, he's going to be at odds with Hiskia, and the Gemara is going to say, how does the purchaser carry out his obligation to tithe the produce before returning it? And so Hiskia is saying that he takes off some of the leaves. Formulation by Rabbi Yochanan is not going to be the same. He's going to say that he pays the value of one of the bundles and rectifies the other bundles with it before returning it. In other words, he's going to fix the other bundles by designating, one bundle for the others. And Hiskia is just saying that he can take out some of the leaves as tithes without paying for them. Rabbi Yochanan's point, says the Marafulda, is going to be that he's going to separate the entire bundle of actual vegetables that he's going to tithe and pay for. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in his Beur is going to point out that the Gemara does not mean that he must separate out an entire bundle as tithes, but really he just has to take out what is necessary from one of the bundles, even if it's going to be less than the bundle, and he's going to pay for that. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to be saying that you can't just take out the leaves, you actually have to be taking out vegetables, and you pay for those vegetables that you've taken out. So we're almost going to be finishing up here. The Gemara is going to question the Mishnah's ruling that the purchaser returns the tithed vegetables to the seller. And in other words, he's going to be asking, what is this process of the return? And the Gemara says that he returns them, how does he return them tithed? And the Gemara says that he does it not turn out that by doing so, he creates a stumbling block for those who come to purchase the returned produce after him. So in the last halacha, we were worried about stumbling blocks. And in this Mishnah, really what this is saying is that if you separate out the tithes from this now rectified produce, it's not subject to tithes. And then, what could happen is it could get intermingled. It could get mixed up with this other untithed produce. And now you can have a case where a chaver comes back and is buying already tithed produce intermingled with the other produce, and now you have a mess because you have fixed and rectified produce, and it was already tithed. And a chaver who's going to go buy vegetables from the seller now is going to assume that they all have tithes, or same status of no tithes, and he's now going to be tithing from vegetables that have already been tithed, or he's going to have vegetables that weren't tithed on behalf of vegetables that are tithed, and there's a problem to return this produce that's tithed, and you've effectively created a stumbling block. And the Gemara is going to answer how to deal with it. It's going to say, when returning the tithe vegetables, he does not mix them into the rest of the seller's vegetables, but rather he makes them into a distinct pile in front of them. So the Vilna Goan says about this that the purchaser makes them into a distinct pile and instruct the sellers not to sell them together with the other vegetables because they've already been tithed. And another way to look at it, says the Pnei Moshe, is that nothing needs to be said because the very fact is that the haver who purchased them put them into a distinct pile, and it's clear that this has already been tithed. My baby hit his head, and he's a little bit fetchy. But I get the credit of teaching him Torah. So the Gemara is going to continue with the need of the purchaser to do the tithes and how he's going to tithe it before he returns it. And the Gemara is going to say, let the purchaser affix the required tithes in his own untithed produce at home. So he's saying, why are you going to be tithing this fellow's produce and returning it back to him? If you're worried about making a mess and creating a stumbling block for the merchant, who is an Am Haaretz, he's not going to know how to handle this, and you're worried about making a stumbling block, the Gemara is answering a question. You're allowed to tithe for produce that you have over here for produce over there. And certainly you've taken acquisition of it. You own this produce at the shuk right now. So Gemara is asking a question. Why don't you just tithe the produce that you have in your hand now at the shuk for produce that you don't have tithed yet at your house? Why don't you exchange this for that? Which is going to be allowed? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say that a Baraisa says that a person may sell untithed produce to his friend and affix the tithes for his fellow's produce that he sold him in his own untithed produce at his house. So he is allowed to change this produce for that produce, even though it's far away. And the Gemara also in Trubos is going to be talking about that. Anyway, this Brisa is going to permit it, but it's going to continue. It's going to say, although he makes a stumbling block for those who come after him, and we're not, worried that maybe he's going to forget, part of the produce at home that he's already separated out as tithes. In other words, the Gemara is effectively saying, that's very nice that you can do that, but you're going to be making a stumbling block for yourself. And, part of the problem is you're going to forget that you didn't take out, you might have part of it that's already been tithed, and you might go ahead and retithe that one. So in the case over here of returning it to this merchant directly that you tithed, that a haver may come and buy it and then go tithe it, what this is worried about is this haver may forget about this because, this is pretty trivial in terms of being at the shuk and returning a bundle. And he may go home and retithe the produce, and you're not allowed to tithe produce twice. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that Rabbi Hanina says the rabbis instituted affixing tithes in untithed produce that somebody has at home only in the case of someone who sells untithed produce to a buyer, but they did not affix this to tithes on untithed produce that you have at home in the case of a returner of Demai that he's purchased. So, in other words, the Mara Fuld is pointing out that what this Gemara is saying is for this leniency that, we are worried that one may forget that part of the produce has already been designated as tithe. But in this Mishnah, he has to separate out the tithes from the actual produce that he's returning. And the rabbis are lenient in the case of the seller to allow him to designate the tithes from his own produce. So the worry here is that the rabbis made an exception and allowed him to separate some of his own produce for tithes. But we're worried that either he's going to mess up and separate the tithes again, or this other person who just got back the produce is going to sell it to a haver, it's going to get mixed up, it's going to get tithed again. Either way, it makes a stumbling block. So the Gemara now is going to address, so it looks like in the Gemara it prefers, by the way, that if you have the choice between doing this from here to your home or doing this in front of the merchant, it looks like it's preferable to do it to the merchant. So the Gemara is going to move on and it's going to talk about the last part of the Mishnah. The last part of the Mishnah is talking about that he was standing and purchasing a load of vegetables. He saw another load of vegetables that was better than what he was just handling, and he decides to buy that load instead, and he's permitted to return this load without tithing it. Why? Because he did not actually make an acquisition. He was just inspecting them. So this is the meaning of the Mishnah, that he was standing and inspecting which vegetables to purchase. In other words, it's saying that he did not actually lift it and acquire it. He was inspecting it. Now, the Gemara is going to ask a logical question, and it's going to, it's going to say, well, what happens if you're inspecting vegetables and you put it down to inspect a better quality load of vegetables, but this load of vegetables is actually a different vegetable. So let's say you were handling carrots, and now you're going to pick up cabbage. What's going to happen in that circumstance? What's going to be the law? And the Gemara says that so far we learned this exemption applies to one who's occupied with the same type of vegetables and returns it in favor of better quality vegetables with the same. And the Gemara says, but does this exemption apply even when he returns the first load for another type of vegetables? And the Vilna Goan is going to answer it and say, yes, in fact, it does. So if you didn't make the acquisition, then you didn't make an acquisition. So if you traded from carrots to cabbage and you've acquired the cabbage, you've acquired the cabbage. And if you didn't acquire, you were inspecting the carrots, but you didn't acquire them, you didn't acquire them. We're going to move on to Halacha 3 tomorrow, and that's going to be on what happens if you're finding lost produce on the road. Are you going to be able to eat it, or are you going to have to shelter it, or are you going to have to tithe it? What do you do? Have a great day.